Eat eggs. Don't eat eggs. Carbs are bad. Here, have some carbs. Eat this fat. Don't eat that fat. Nutrition advice can change directions fast enough to give you whiplash, so you might feel a sense of relief to learn that one thing has stayed the same: trans fats remain bad for you. That's the word on fats, according to the latest study from the World Health Organization, WHO, even though the food industry has just petitioned the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to allow for a slowdown of the required phasing out of artificial trans fats from foods. Our review is consistent with several previous studies of trans fats that show a direct association with heart disease and support their removal from the food supply, says lead study author Russell D'Souza, Doctor of Science, Assistant Professor of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Marian Nestle, Ph.D., Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at New York University in Manhattan, says the study confirms what we know about trans fats. These are in junk foods, she says, so the overall dietary advice remains what it has been for decades: eat a largely plant-based diet, and don't eat too much junk food. Trans fats are present in many packaged and frozen baked goods, cake mixes, fried foods, and even coffee creamers. Most trans fats are artificial, made by adding hydrogens to fat molecules to make them more stable and long-lasting. But some occur naturally in small amounts in dairy and meats. D'Souza says, the source of trans fat may be important, but this is difficult to tease apart, he says. The difference between artificial and natural trans fats may just be a matter of how much. To evaluate the health risks associated with trans and saturated fats, D'Souza and his co-authors pooled the data from 41 studies on fats and their association with death, and with health problems like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. They then processed all results together, giving findings from the better, larger studies more weight. To cross-check this step, the authors used a standardized method to confirm the strengths and weaknesses of the studies. Their paper was published in the August 2015 British Medical Journal. The results of this painstaking data distillation showed a consistent link between trans fats and heart disease, but the story that emerged around saturated fats isn't all that consistent. While we did not find that higher saturated fat caused harm, we also saw no clear evidence of benefit, D'Souza says. Our study does not support an increase in the allowable amount of saturated fat in the diet at this time. He notes that they also couldn't completely rule out that saturated fats are associated with an increased risk of death from heart disease. Trans fats have a negative health effect because they raise bad, or LDL, cholesterol and suppress good, or HDL, cholesterol, according to D'Souza. Saturated fat, on the other hand, is a little more of a mixed fat bag. It raises both kinds of cholesterol. D'Souza says the cardiovascular effects of trans fats include increasing inflammation and harming the cells that line the arteries. Nestle says that this study is not the first to reach similar conclusions, but this one comes from the WHO and deserves to be taken seriously, she says. Ingeborg Brouwer, Ph.D., Professor of Nutrition at VU University in Amsterdam, offers one caution about the report. The authors evaluated data from studies that recorded observations but didn't change variables, like fat, to see if the changes affected outcomes. You can only say something about a possible effect of a fat if you say what it is replaced by, and that is not really possible in these kinds of studies, Dr. Brouwer says. She notes in an email that the authors themselves write that any guidelines should also consider the health effects of what consumers use to replace fats in their diet. I fully agree with that, she says. As an example, she cites studies showing that replacing saturated fats with carbs has pretty neutral effects on cholesterol. So replacing saturated fat with sugar is probably not improving heart health, she says. So what do these findings mean for the consumer? D'Souza says the advice around trans fats remains essentially the same: cut them out of your diet. Noting a trend to greater acceptance of saturated fat consumption, he says that their results don't support increasing saturated fat intake. Individual eating habits should continue to emphasize whole grains, unsaturated fat from plant oils, and nuts, fruits, and vegetables, he says. We think the saturated fat recommendations are about right. Those recommendations are to keep the percentage of calories you get from saturated fats in the single digits. After taking this holistic view of studies on trans and saturated fats, D'Souza says the next step is a more holistic view of how people eat. Diets associated with good health, like the Mediterranean diet, do have relatively low saturated fat, he notes, but the fat factor isn't all that matters. People don't eat individual nutrients, so we'd like to further explore the effects of food combinations on disease risk, which is more relevant to how people eat. He says, there is no one nutrient or food that's responsible for all heart disease, diabetes, or death. The whole diet matters.